What's the worst thing someone tried to correct you about something you're specialized at? Story 1. I studied history at uni and worked for a while as a tour guide in Prague, Czech Republic. I had a customer once on a walking tour of the city go really snarky with me because I called the river running through the city the Vltava. He declared to the whole tour that that wasn't its name. I asked him if he'd heard it referred to as the Moldau, as that was the German name for the river during the Habsburg era when German was the official language, but he said no. And was I stupid? The river was called the Danube. I pointed to him that the Danube doesn't run through Prague and asked if maybe he was thinking of Brno. No, he had definitely read in a guidebook that it was the Danube, and why the hell was he paying money for this tour if the guy didn't even know what the river was called? At this point, another tourist in the group showed him her guidebook, which clearly said Vltava. Then another showed him a map, and another showed him another guidebook, and so on until the whole group had basically shown him what a twazzer he was being. He didn't apologize, of course, but at least he shut up for the rest of the tour. Story 2. So, Canadian lawyer here. I used to do primarily firearms law. I taught a course in firearms law at university. I've been consulted on it by lawyers. And I've had judges tell other lawyers to phone me with firearms law questions. I had a law student telling me that I was oh so wrong about firearms law on a particular topic. Eventually, they went and cited a particular case, which I politely advised them they were wrong about. They kept going, talking about how just because I'm a lawyer and they're a student doesn't mean they're wrong. Meanwhile, I'm just holding my tongue. Eventually, someone chimed in to be like, don't you know who that is? And the case you cited was a case he personally argued and won on. Satisfying as fuck. Story 3. A new house gets built next door to mine, and shortly after the owners move in, they knock on my door to complain that my house is built too high. I explained that my house was and is built on flat ground, and their builder has built their house lower and undercut my fence. The guy proceeds to give a long-winded spiel about how earthworks are done and my house is too high and I have to fix it. I then explained that I do earthworks for a living and have done the earthworks for 300 plus houses in my suburb alone and around 1,200 in the local area. I name his builder, site supervisor, engineer, the exact floor levels in the street, and the law that says that he has to pay to fix my fence. He still hasn't paid, and legal procedures are beginning soon. Earthworks in this case are the removal of topsoil and any mud or clay or organic matter from beneath where the house is going to go, and replacing it with clean compacted sand, trimmed dead flat to within 10 millimeters. Because his block was lowered and leveled to suit his engineer, he is responsible for retaining the land around him, which is now higher than his. I was prepared to let it slide because his place being lower now helps my drainage in heavy rain. But when he wanted me to pay for his retaining wall responsibility and would not pay for his half of the fence, I decided that I had enough bluster and bullshit. Time to pay up. What's earthworks? Like leveling the ground? Story 4. I work in lightning protection here in the States. I do the estimating and the designs for the largest company in the Southeast. Have for going on 7 years. Certified through our industry certification company. The amount of engineers and architects that love to argue with me about the code is astounding. I live by that code. Being I estimate and design systems, my main job is to know that code. The worst was the Army Corps of Engineers. We had a project that their designer designed that was in the bid package drawings. Pretty standard. Pick out the materials requested and ignore the incorrect design. That is how we bid on it, won it, and designed it. This would have provided them with a fully certified system. In our business, a UL Master Label certification is as close to a requirement for every job as anything can be. 2 weeks after we submit our design, it comes back with a revised and resubmit stamp, and a very snarky demand from the Corps that we change our design to the one provided in the bid package. I went back and forth on emails and calls with the engineers trying to explain to them that their system would not work, was potentially a dangerous hazard, and ultimately could not be certified or warranted. They came back basically with, "We don't care what you say. We know better. Do it." So I did, designed exactly like they had, and put a disclaimer on the drawing saying there would be issues and we were not responsible. A few months go by, it's installed and ready for certification. They call the inspector out and he fails it without even getting on the roof. The Army is pissed and tried to come back at us. I politely forward the countless email chains to the officer in charge. Now they scramble to get it up to code. As a consequence, it resulted in us issuing a change order to bring it up to code, which was around 75% of the original cost of the project. Story 5. Got a ton of these when I worked at a video game store. My favorite was a guy who came in around the time Skyrim came out and asked if we had the new Elder Scrolls game. I said, "Oh, you mean Skyrim?" He laughed condescendingly and said, "No, I mean Scrim." Thinking he was just mistaken, I was like, "Oh no, it's called Skyrim." "No, it's not. It's pronounced scrim. At that point, I realized he didn't even want the game. He just wanted to show up the girl working in the game store with his superior knowledge. Also had someone come in demanding the Mario game on PS1. When I said no such thing existed, he immediately went ballistic, screaming that it does exist, and he played it at his friend's house. He eventually stormed out of the store yelling about how stupid I was, guessing he had that interaction at a few other game stores that day. Story 6. I worked in orthopedics as a medical assistant for over 13 years. In the last practice I worked, there was a surgeon who was always right and could never admit to being wrong about anything. He also always had to point out if someone else was wrong. You know the type. I had worked up a patient and took her history regarding her hip issues. If a patient had any prior x-rays or other images, we would pull those images up in the computer. This lady had previously had a fluoroscopic hip injection, so I pulled up the images from that procedure and documented it in the office note. After the doctor in question had seen the patient, he was at the computer workstation making more documentation into a record. I was standing there at the desk along with a couple of other medical assistants. The doctor says, "Oh, by the way, the lady has not had a fluoroscopic hip injection," so I took that documentation out of her note. As I said earlier, I had been working in the ortho for 13 years, and I knew a little bit about it. So me being the hard-headed person I am, beginning to argue with the doctor that yes, indeed, this woman had had the procedure. He argued right back. I said, "I pulled the images up in the exam room." He said, "Sometimes you can confuse a hip injection with an SI injection." No, you can't. You can literally see the needle going into the hip joint. And it was also labeled. So then he said, "Okay, let's go back and look at those images and I'll show you." So we went back to the exam room and I pulled the images back up and he sat down at the computer to look at them. I stood there and watched him look at those pictures for at least a minute as he realized he was wrong and didn't want to admit it. He finally stood up and said, "You were right. I'll add the documentation back to the note." And he stormed out of the room without another word. I hated that asshole. Story 7. In the Netherlands, we have different sized glasses for a Pilsner. They all have different names. The smallest, 0.18 liters, is called a flute. The middle, a vase, and the large, 0.5 liter, we call half a liter or pint. Sometimes the bar has a medium of 0.33 liters as well, which doesn't really have a name. Anyway, most people drink flutes or vases. You'd order a flute, please, or a vase, please, and you'll always be served the house Pilsner. The most well-known one is Heineken, of course, and the size you ordered. As you might have guessed by now, I am a bartender. I was at work in a bar and had a group of 5 dudes drinking vases. A lot of them, too. The thing is, if your order is a beer, you'll be served a vase of Pilsner as a standard. Everyone knows this. It's common knowledge, the Netherlands, and no one ever objects to it. These dudes had been ordering 5 beers, please, the whole night. They were served vases, so 0.25 liters the whole night. When the time came to pay, I gave them their bill and it said 35 times vase PF Heineken. Then they tried to argue with me that the glass I served them, the 0.25 liter one, is not a vase, but a flute. That a flute was 0.25 and not 0.18. And that a vase is 0.33 liters. I told them, dudes, I was not going to argue about something as ridiculous as this, as anyone who drinks beer in the Netherlands know what a flute and a vase are, and everyone knows what size they are. But they refused to pay, so I told them to Google it. They did. They found a website that listed the sizes and names of the glasses, but they wouldn't believe it because the website must be owned by Heineken, sure. A flute and vase conspiracy, that's a new one. They told me the bar next door serves a vase of 0.33 liters for the same price we serve a 0.25 liter one, so they weren't going to pay. I told them to cut their crap, that I work in that bar too, I do, and that the price of a 0.33 was higher than our 0.25, that it's not called a vase. They didn't believe me and looked up the drinks menu, as if it would even matter what the prices next door were, even if they would be lower. He found that, once again, I was right, but had some excuse as to why I was still wrong. In the end, I told them to pay or I'd call the cops. So they paid but said they were going to write a complaint email, which I encouraged them to do. At this point, even other customers were telling them to stop being ridiculous. I kindly asked them to never return again. They came back a week later, but I told them they would not be served. They tried ordering drinks from my coworker, but he just told them to f off too. So they just stood at the bar for a while and left. F***ing idiots. Story 8. I worked in a jewelry store, specializing in vintage, and this 50-plus-year-old man with a much younger woman dangling from his arm asked me to pull out a few pieces, shushed me when I tried to present the products, and went on a pompous rant about, "And you see, darling, in the Middle Ages, doctors would grind precious stones like emeralds to dust and make a drink to their patients as a remedy. They called it ambrosia." He turned to me, grinning, and added, "But I bet you didn't know that." I just said, in the meekest voice possible, I'm sorry, sir, I think you mean electuel. Ambrosia was the drink of the divinities in Grecian mythology. His mouth just dangled open for a couple of seconds before snapping audibly shut, and he barked, "How does someone like you know that?" Still with the meekest voice possible. "Because that's my job, sir." "Sorry, sir, but you asked, sir." I don't know if it was the utter powerlessness in his face or my very serious eagerness to please the customer's face, but his girlfriend just started to gleefully laugh at him, and he just turned his heels and power walked out of the shop. Guess I lost a sale, but hey, he did ask me. Story 9. Not 100% the question, but I was training a coworker the other day. I work at a gas station with an app where you can pay without a card or coming inside. It doesn't always work great, so the customer came in to pay inside, and my other coworker was dealing with him until she said, "Hey John, the register is giving me this error while I'm trying to pay this lady." I look over there and see that the pump had been authorized via the app. As I start explaining this to the person who has worked for the company less than a week and the customer, the newbie starts yelling at me saying, "No, that's the money I just prepaid on the pump." As she was waving the money the customer had handed her in front of my face. I continued to try and explain it to her, and she continued to give me an attitude like she knew she was right. It took all my energy not to say, "You mean the money that is still in your hand that the register is not letting you put in because the pump is already authorized and cannot be prepaid? The pump that is showing someone swiped a card at it? You've been here 2 weeks. I've been here 2 years. Don't ask me questions if you don't want the answers." What I did actually say was, after the customer had left, "Hey, could you not give me an attitude when I answer?" Story 10. I specialize in mental health, and a friend tried to argue that bulimia is the throwing up thing. After explaining that bulimia consists of the binge-purge cycle and that even though vomiting is a common purge method, it's not the only one, she still didn't quite get it. She seemed to think that because it was a common method of purge, it must be present to be diagnosed as bulimia. I've had to make clarifications to many people about many different mental health issues, but that one stuck out. I think because of how certain she was that she was right. It wasn't the first time she'd refused to believe she was anything other than right. I just wanted to clarify the differences between anorexia and bulimia. Someone with bulimia will likely have a very normal diet, but when they experience a depressive or anxious episode, they'll go on an uncontrolled binge. In more severe cases, this binge could be higher than 2,000 calories, on top of their normal day intake. Following a binge, the individual will feel enormous amounts of regret, anger, and/or fear about the binge, and they'll begin trying to purge it from their body in whatever way they choose. With anorexia, the individual will likely have reduced their daily calorie intake to below 1,000 calories. They may engage in compulsively checking the calorie content of their food, and perhaps weighing foods that otherwise don't need to be weighed out. Additionally, an individual with anorexia may also purge as an aid to their weight loss intentions. Story 11. I give Planetarium shows, and at the end, I hang around so that people can come to talk to me or ask questions. Usually it's small children that want to tell me about their favorite planet or something equally cute. But there are always old dudes that wait around so they can tell me something wrong they noticed in the show. They're never correct. Most recently, during part of my show, I put up a picture of the moon and the earth, and when I show it, I point out that this picture is to scale, i.e. the size and distance between them are accurate. After the show, this guy was adamant that to scale is meaningless unless you give the conversion, 1 to 2 or 5 to 672, etc. I tried to make a joke a couple of times to diffuse the situation, but he wouldn't leave. It was so hard not to tell him he was wrong. I forgot to say this the first time around. The weirdest part of this interaction was that this was something I said exactly one time around 7 minutes into an hour-long show. And after all that time, he still thought it was important enough to spend like 5 minutes correcting me on it. I firmly believe that there are amateur astronomers who go to planetarium shows just because they want to correct people on things. It's weird. Story 12. Wrote software for a large interactive art piece. It was presented in such a way that it encouraged self-discovery of how it was used. But it wasn't difficult, and most people picked up on the main operation of it very, very quickly, as it should have been. There were 3 stations that interacted together but were separated by some distance. I see some guy very flamboyantly operating the device. It created music, lights, and fire, and explaining how it works to a small crowd around him. I'm intrigued, so I walk over to hear him. He's figured it all out, basking in the adulation of those around him. But he's wrong, like way off. So after listening for a bit, I gently and politely point out how it differs from what he's saying. He looks around at his crowd and tells me I'm way off and don't get it, that I just don't understand. This is more perplexing because simple operation and observation contradicted what he was stating. Anyway, I again politely explain a bit more to further illustrate where he was wrong. He told me I just didn't know what I was talking about. I hesitated and considered just thanking him and walking away, but then thought better of it. I looked at him and told him I wrote the software for what he was doing and had been writing and running it on my laptop at home every night for the last 6 months. The crowd's attitude changed. People thanked me, and I wandered off. It was weird how invested that guy was being right and the center of attention. At least he was polite at the end. Story 13. I'm an application engineer for big plants and mills and such, power, paper, chemical, etc. My specialization is to make sure that, given process data, their pumps, pipes, valves, and controllers, pneumatic, pressure-operated physical part, all work nicely with a DCS, digital control system, electric part, so nothing breaks or explodes a tank or whatnot. I had an old-school professional engineer at a power company come to me and hand me a valve with a hole in it, and basically tell me to fix it. Let me explain. Valves don't just magically get holes in them. That's a very strange mode of failure. And your newly religious valve's not going to get fixed. You have to get a new one at that point. This is about a $30,000 valve too, and not cheap. I tactfully explained that he needs a new one and we redo the data. Everything checks out, and we relay this to the PE, stating that he should recheck his process. He scoffs, saying, "All of our data is correct. It's your valve that broke." Okay, not technically wrong, but besides using conditions given to us by the facility, he's going on and on about how I'm, ironically, not a professional. Technically, I'm not a PE. Generally PO'd about 30 grand. Forgot to mention there were 4 identical lines going to a boiler. Identical valves. $30,000 a pop. Sent the findings to the failure analysis team, and they came back saying the damage is consistent with low flow. Like the dude gave us the wrong data, then insisted we were wrong and insulted me in the process. It's their fault, and they're paying $120,000 for replacements. It gets better. Mr. High and Mighty doesn't want to buy new, then buys from a reseller. Fine and cheaper, if it works. Resellers don't size, they just try to match and sell, and this is a very particular application. Using my work, he sends the bad data to the reseller, got refurbished valves for cheaper, and installed them. Destroyed his multi-million-dollar boiler in 2 months. Never felt bad for the guy. Story 14. I don't specialize in it, but I figured I would include it anyway since it pissed me off. I've been studying the Korean language for years and years. Last year, I moved to South Korea to take a one-on-one accelerated course with a Korean tutor. I'm hoping to someday adopt a Korean child, not an infant, and move him or her to the US. Therefore, I want to make sure I can fully communicate. Because of this, I was pretty serious about paying the bigger bucks for a private tutor. With her, I studied for an average of 20 hours per week, plus an additional 10 or so in my own time. I dedicated a lot of time to my studies, in addition to practicing newly acquired skills with the locals. I would say I learned a lot. When I returned to the US, I discovered my coworker, who was one of those know-it-alls entitled people, started talking to me how she'd taken up an interest in Korean as well, mostly because of that one K-pop group, which is fine and all, cool, I really didn't care. But it's when she started going off about how she learned how to read the alphabet but got confused with some of it that ticked me off. I literally took all of my lunch breaks to sit down and explain it to her, because I knew, but she kept telling me it didn't seem right. No matter how much I told her, she said it was wrong. She's the type who always has to be right. Even if she's wrong, she's right. Even her opinions have to be superior. Because I hate debating, I would usually just drop the subject. But this time, I was so enraged, which I never get. After a few minutes of listening to her thinking out loud, I said, "Look, I went to this country, studied my ass off with a tutor, and you're telling me it's not right? Sure, go ahead and learn it wrong. If thinking you're right helps you sleep at night." We don't talk about it anymore. Story 15. I'm in marketing. I write a ton of copy and create ads of various sorts. I'm a native speaker of English. I had a coworker, Dan, whose native language was not English, ask me to proofread something for him before he sent it to the printer. I was happy to help. There was a grammatical error in one of the sentences, one that wouldn't be immediately evident to a non-native speaker. I marked the change and gave it back to him. This was on a Friday at the end of the day, so I left after giving it to him and think any more of it. Well, fast forward to Monday afternoon. It ends up the printer printed the piece over the weekend with the error. Dan's boss Allie was in his office and she was livid because it would need to be reprinted to the tune of several $1,000s. She asked him if he had it proofed and he had the nerve to say, "Yes, Lena proofed it before I sent it." Oh, no. I went in at that point and said, "Hey, Allie, I didn't proof it." But Dan opted to print it without making the change I noted. Allie said, "Dan, is this true?" Well, knowing he was called out, he said, "Yes, Lena did mark the change, but it just didn't sound right to me." What the f***, Dan? Anyway, Allie turned on her heel and walked out at that point. As she was walking out, she said, "Dan, Have that change made now, and see how quickly you can get the piece back on press. Going forward, you pass any printer proofs by me before going on press. Needless to say, I never ever proofed anything for Dan again. I sent him elsewhere because I refused to be thrown under the bus again.